Well, it's all too easy for many of us to lose perspective in long-running conflicts like the civil war in Syria, but sometimes it's a single picture that drives it all home. This is Omran, the 5-year-old boy sitting there in an ambulance, face bloodied, covered in debris. And this single image captures the horrors of war faced daily by those who live in Aleppo, including many children. Omran was pulled from the rubble after an airstrike destroyed his home. But he is not alone, and he's really the lucky one. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says more than 4,500 children have been killed in just Aleppo in the more than 5 years of fighting there. We have CNN's Nema Al-Bagher joining me now from London. Tell us more about this little boy, Nema, that is just, he's capturing just really the hearts and I think so much emotion from people all over the world.
Well, he's given people a moment of pause, hasn't he? Because what we've come to expect from these images in Syria is the noise, the screaming, the aerial bombardment, the barrel bombs. And in the middle of all this, you have the perfect stillness of this dazed child. And it's almost kind of pulled into focus everything around him in that moment. We spoke to the cameraman who took these images, and he described to us how they dug for nearly an hour to try and pull Omran out from under the rubble of what was his home. And you can only imagine being 5 years old, being trapped in the dark, and these voices calling on you to stay strong, to stay calm. And when you see him in that footage, Brianna, he still didn't know that the rest of his family had survived. His mother and his brother, we understand, are still in horribly critical condition, and because of the circumstances inside Aleppo and because of the complete disintegration of the healthcare infrastructure, they've had to be smuggled out of Aleppo now to seek care. But as you said, he is unbelievably one of the lucky ones, Brianna.
He is, and it's sort of, you just see the daze and how he realizes he's bleeding and sort of wipes it on the seat. I mean, there's just this sense of nothing, a child shouldn't go through this. You have the EU now, Nema, calling for an immediate cessation of violence. Russia now says it's open to a UN proposal for temporary halts in its airstrikes. Tell us about that.
Russia has now amazingly indicated that they are looking towards as early as next week for what they're calling a humanitarian pause. And while a lot of those we're speaking to inside the international aid groups and inside the UN are hopeful that this moment, this child, this global pause that he has wrought, that it will result in something tangible on the ground for not just himself and his family, but their friends and their neighbors and the hundreds of thousands that are trapped alongside them inside Aleppo. We're waiting to see if that actually does materialize, but there is a sense that he has, in his impassive silence, that he has pushed open this window. And we spoke to one of the doctors who was in the hospital that was treating him, and he said, yes, he is in extreme shock, and this was the bit that really broke my heart, but actually he's 5 years old. He is as old as the conflict itself. This is what he knows. This is the generation of children in Aleppo who are taught not to cry when they hear airstrikes going on, because the worry is that that will draw the danger to them. So as much as what you're seeing there is shock, it is also just a child who has become accustomed to the realities of the horror, Brianna.
Yeah, and we've seen this before too, the refugee crisis. It's the children that I think remind people of their humanity, and we're seeing that with this. Nema Al-Bagher for us there. Thank you so much for your report, and for ways that you can help the Syrians. You can go to cnn.com/impact. Now, still ahead, the Pentagon says U.S.-backed coalition forces are making significant progress in the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. We'll get a live update from Baghdad. The fight against ISIS is a contentious campaign issue right now. Just this week, Donald Trump proposed extreme vetting, that was what he called it, of immigrants and joint military operations abroad. U.S. defense officials say there is significant progress in taking back key territory from ISIS. For more, we are joined now by Colonel Chris Garver. He is the spokesman for the anti-ISIS coalition in Iraq. And Colonel, thank you so much for joining us. And if you can just give us a sense of what the state of the fight is against ISIS right now.
Thanks, Brianna. I'm glad to be here tonight. The state of the fight against ISIS is that ISIS is getting weaker in Iraq and Syria as our partners on the ground, the Iraqi security forces in Iraq and then the Syrian Democratic Forces and our other partners in Syria as they're getting stronger. We're seeing significant progress both in Iraq and Syria. And just recently, the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian Arab Coalition element of that seized the town of Manbij, which was a significant line of communication between Raqqa, the self-proclaimed capital of the so-called caliphate that ISIS holds, and the rest of the world. So that was a significant victory for the Syrian Democratic Forces, and we're continuing to see progress like that in both Iraq and Syria.
And we're seeing some of that progress there on the ground. We also know that tens of thousands of ISIS fighters have been killed by coalition forces. But we've also seen that as ISIS there on that battlefield maybe struggles a little bit, is losing territory, we've seen them branch out. For instance, the airport attack in Istanbul. What do you do to try to stop just the movement, really, of the threat from where you are to other soft targets abroad?
Well, clearly it's a significant problem, and it is a global problem. And we know that ISIS wants to conduct these attacks in our hometowns, in our countries, no matter what's happening inside Iraq and Syria. But the caliphate that they have declared, the center of their own country in between where they stole pieces of Iraq and stole pieces of Syria, that has been a rallying cry and a sense of recruitment and inspiration for fighters, sickos, crazies around the world. We need to defeat that here in Iraq and Syria to take away that inspiration. And then clearly there's work to be done all around the globe to kind of beat this ideology that ISIS has injected into the world.
We've seen this image, Colonel, of this little boy, this 5-year-old in Aleppo, Omran, we've learned his name is. Earlier this week, Russia said it was close to a deal with the U.S. on joint military action against militants in Aleppo. I think a lot of people have stopped maybe paying attention to Syria, but then they see something like this, they pay attention, and they want to know what could be happening with this development. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the negotiations between Russia and the coalition led by the United States, they are ongoing. They're being led by our State Department and our Department of Defense. We do not have an arrangement with them yet. We are conducting our operations against ISIL, and we remain focused on ISIL. We've seen the Russians and the Syrian regime be focused on rebels and on doing things other than just fighting ISIL. So we are, there's no deal yet, and we're continuing to conduct our operations against ISIS.
They say, I mean, the Russians are saying that they're targeting ISIS, but you don't believe that because of where they're targeting.
That's correct. They target some areas where we know there are concentrations of ISIS fighters, and then they target areas where we don't see any ISIS fighters. And we see that on about a quarter of their strikes seem to be where there are ISIS fighters, and then the rest of them, the majority of them are elsewhere. We welcome those who want to fight ISIS, and those negotiations are ongoing, but we would also look for someone to demonstrate some level of trust that they're actually trying to do that.
Russia's military, for the first time, launched airstrikes against Syrian targets, which you were just talking about, those targets, and they've done this from a base inside of Iran. The U.S. Certainly disputes that ISIS is the target, as you mentioned, but other than that, what are your concerns with this cooperation with Iran?
Well, our primary concern as we fight ISIS in both Iraq and Syria is the safety of our pilots and of our partnered forces on the ground. We want to make sure that our pilots are safe, which is why we have an understanding and a mechanism to call, the Russians call us or we call them when we're conducting operations around each other to make sure that our planes don't bump into each other or that they don't have an incident in the air. We also want them to not bomb where our coalition partners are, and we've seen that happen before. So those are our main concerns as we remain focused on ISIS, that they keep their operations away from where we're conducting operations.
All right, Colonel Chris Garver, thank you so much for joining us from the region. We certainly appreciate it. He's with the Anti-ISIS Coalition in Iraq. And that is it for me. I'm going to be back at 5 Eastern on the Situation Room. Hope you will join me. For our international viewers